Welcome to the HFY Tales channel. Remember to like and subscribe if you like the story. Enjoy and take care. The sounds of battle rumbled like distant thunder, echoing through the dense, humid jungle of Carthal. The lush, towering trees stood as silent witnesses to the brutal conflict between humans and the Thara, a warrior race of Amazon-like females known for their unparalleled strength and unyielding sense of honor. Sergeant Daniel Gray crouched low behind a cluster of large alien ferns, wiping sweat from his brow. His combat suit was designed to regulate his body temperature, but in the stifling heat of the Carthal jungles, it could only do so much. His breathing was steady, though his pulse raced, a reflection of both his heightened awareness and the adrenaline surging through his veins. Daniel's visor displayed flickering red alerts. The comms were down, and the rest of his squad had either been scattered or neutralized by the Thara ambush. For now, he was alone, deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by the towering trees and the unseen dangers lurking in the shadows. The Thara, a race of fierce female warriors, had become humanity's most formidable enemy. Their culture was steeped in honor, and their warriors were trained from birth to embrace death on the battlefield as the ultimate glory. The Thara viewed mercy as a weakness, a dishonorable stain that tainted a warrior's legacy. To them, a warrior who fell in combat deserved nothing less than a swift, clean death, and anyone who spared an enemy was no warrior at all. Daniel knew this all too well. He had faced them before in skirmishes across other planets in this war that now stretched across multiple systems. Humanity had expanded too quickly, and in their search for new resources, they had encroached on Thara territory. The result was an all-out war, a bloody conflict that had claimed thousands of lives on both sides. And now here he was, stranded on Carthal, with little hope of extraction. The jungle around him was a cacophony of sounds, strange alien birds calling to one another, the rustle of thick leaves as small creatures scurried through the underbrush. But amid the natural noises, there was something else, something deliberate, the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving with precision through the foliage. Daniel's muscles tensed, his grip tightening on his pulse rifle. He scanned his surroundings, eyes darting from one shadow to the next. The Thara were known for their speed and agility, their ability to blend into their surroundings until the perfect moment to strike. And then, there it was. A flicker of movement, a shadow darting through the trees, fast and silent, too fast for any of the native creatures. She's here. Before he could react, the figure exploded from the underbrush, barreling toward him with terrifying speed. Daniel barely had time to raise his rifle before the attack came, a blur of motion that knocked the weapon from his hands and sent him crashing to the ground. He hit the forest floor hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. His helmeted head smacked against the thick roots of a tree, and for a moment his vision blurred. But years of military training kicked in, and he rolled to his feet, pulling the combat knife from his belt just in time to see his attacker. She was tall, towering over him by at least a head, her muscular form silhouetted against the faint light filtering through the jungle canopy. Her skin, a deep shade of violet, gleamed with sweat, and her eyes blazed with fury. In each hand she held a blade, curved and deadly, their edges glinting in the dim light. Jara. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard of her. Jara, the undefeated Thara warrior, feared and revered by her people. She was known for her brutality in combat, for her refusal to show mercy, and for the dozens of human soldiers who had fallen to her blades. And now, she stood before him, wounded but still dangerous, her gaze fixed on him with cold, predatory focus. "This is where it ends for you, human," she said, her voice cold and determined, sending a chill through Daniel. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation. He glanced at her shoulder, where a deep wound from an earlier encounter still bled. Yet she moved as if it didn't matter. Her resolve was unshaken, and her reputation as a fierce warrior was clear in every step she took. Their battle began in silence, each move calculated, each strike carefully placed. Jara moved with a predatory grace, her skill undeniable. Daniel found himself on the defensive, blocking and dodging her swift attacks. He knew he was outmatched in speed and strength, and every second was a test of his endurance. But this wasn't just about the fight. It was about survival, his and hers. He didn't want this to be a fight to the end, but Jara had made it clear there would be no other outcome. As the struggle intensified, Daniel's mind raced. He didn't want to hurt her, but she left him no choice. With a swift move, he managed to catch her wrist, forcing her to drop one of her weapons. A flash of pain crossed her face, but she didn't stop. Her remaining weapon came at him fast, but Daniel ducked and twisted, trapping her arm behind her and bringing her down. Jara struggled beneath him, her strength unyielding even now. She glared at him, her breath heavy with frustration. Though she was at a disadvantage, the fire in her eyes had not dimmed. "Go on," she said, her voice low but steady. "Finish this. You have the upper hand." Daniel hesitated, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him, but something stopped him from delivering the final blow. This wasn't just about winning. It was about something more, a clash of wills, of ideals. He looked at her, and in that moment, he understood her resolve. She was prepared for whatever came next. But Daniel hesitated. He looked into her eyes, those fierce, burning eyes that had seen so much death, so much destruction. He saw a warrior who had been taught that death was the only honorable end to a battle. He saw someone who had never been given another option. And in that moment, he made his choice. "No," he said softly, shaking his head. "I won't." Jara's eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" Daniel lowered his knife, releasing her from his grip. "I'm not going to kill you." For the first time in her life, Jara was speechless. She sat up slowly, her body aching from the fight, but her mind was reeling. No human had ever shown mercy in battle. No Thara would have ever accepted it. "You dishonor me," she spat, though there was uncertainty in her voice. Daniel met her gaze evenly, his voice calm but firm. "No, I'm giving you a second chance." Jara stared at Daniel, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. He had defeated her, had every right, every obligation by Thara standards to kill her. Yet he had spared her life. The concept was so foreign, so unthinkable, that for a moment she wondered if she was still trapped in a fevered dream brought on by her injuries. Her hand clenched around the hilt of her remaining blade, her knuckles turning white. This was weakness. It had to be. The human was too weak to finish what he had started. That was the only explanation. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw no weakness. Instead, she saw resolve, a quiet strength that she couldn't understand. Her throat tightened, a sense of helplessness washing over her that she hadn't felt since she was a child training in the Thara warrior camps. "I don't understand you, human," she finally said, her voice a low growl. "To spare an enemy is to betray your honor. What kind of warrior are you?" Daniel remained calm, though his muscles still ached from their fight. He stepped back, giving her space, but his eyes never left hers. "I fight to protect my people. I fight to survive, but I don't fight to kill if I don't have to." Jara let out a bitter laugh, though there was no joy in it. "You think sparing me will bring you victory? All you've done is delay the inevitable." Daniel shook his head, his expression serious. "This war, it's pointless. We're both losing. I don't want to add more bodies to the pile." Jara's jaw clenched as his words struck a nerve. She had lost friends, comrades, even family members in this war. The Thara prided themselves on strength, but at what cost? How many more would die before either side was willing to admit defeat? For the first time, Jara found herself questioning everything she had been taught. Mercy was a weakness. Death was honor. But as she sat there, staring at the human who had spared her life, she couldn't help but wonder if perhaps they had all been wrong. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the thick jungle foliage. Jara sat in silence, still grappling with the reality of what had transpired. Her people had taught her to see humans as ruthless, bloodthirsty enemies who killed without hesitation. Yet here she was, sitting across from one who had spared her. The wound on her shoulder throbbed, a sharp reminder of her defeat, but it was the wound to her pride that stung the most. Daniel moved cautiously around the small clearing they had found, scanning the surrounding jungle for any signs of danger. they were far from safe. The Thara patrols would no doubt be searching for Jara, and Daniel knew his own squad would be doing the same for him, if any of them had survived the ambush. The uneasy silence between them only deepened the tension that hung in the air. Finally, unable to take it any longer, Jara broke the quiet. "You think this makes you better than me, don't you?" Her voice was laced with bitterness, though there was a hint of curiosity beneath it. Daniel glanced at her, pausing in his watchful pacing. "No, I don't think I'm better than you." Jara's eyes narrowed. "Then why did you spare me? You had every chance to kill me. You should have. By your own logic, I'm still a threat." Daniel sighed, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "I don't think killing you would have solved anything. The war will still go on. More people will die. Sparing you, it's a way of breaking that cycle." Jara let out a harsh laugh. "Breaking the cycle? You think mercy is going to stop this war? You're a fool, human." "Maybe," Daniel replied, his tone even. "But if enough people think that way, maybe things could change." Jara frowned, her gaze hardening as she studied him. "Change? What a quaint idea. My people don't value change. We value strength, honor. Death in battle is the only true end for a warrior." Daniel shook his head, his frustration beginning to show. "Maybe that's the problem." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment Jara's anger flared. She was a warrior, a high-ranking one at that. Her entire life had been dedicated to the pursuit of honor on the battlefield, to proving her strength in combat. And yet, here was this human, questioning everything she believed in, challenging her world view in a way that no one ever had before. She rose to her feet, despite the pain in her shoulder, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You think you understand my people? You think mercy makes you strong? You don't know anything about honor." Daniel stood his ground, his expression calm but unwavering. "I know that honor without compassion is just cruelty, and I've seen enough cruelty in this war." Jara's jaw clenched, her fists tightening at her sides. She could end him now, take back her honor with a single blow, and yet something stopped her. The longer she looked into his eyes, the more she saw something that unsettled her, a quiet conviction, a belief in something greater than mere survival. "I don't need your mercy," she spat, though her voice lacked its usual venom. "I know," Daniel replied softly, "but I gave it anyway." As the jungle's oppressive heat began to fade with the setting sun, Daniel and Jara both knew they couldn't stay in the clearing for long. The Thara patrols were thorough, and if either side found them here, it would mean the end of their tenuous truce. "We need to move," Daniel said, breaking the silence that had fallen between them after their earlier exchange. "If your people find us, I doubt they'll share your hesitation." Jara shot him a cold look. "You think they won't kill you if they find us?" Daniel shrugged. "I'm counting on you to make sure they don't." Jara bristled at the implication. "You think I'll protect you, human?" "You're alive because of me," Daniel pointed out, his tone calm. "That counts for something, doesn't it?" Jara said nothing, but the truth of his words gnawed at her. In Thara culture, a life saved was a life owed. She didn't like it, but Daniel had given her back her life when he could have taken it. By her people's code, she was in his debt, at least until she could find a way to repay him, and that in itself was a bitter pill to swallow. Reluctantly, Jara nodded. "Fine, but don't mistake this for trust." "I wouldn't dream of it," Daniel replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. They set off into the jungle, the underbrush thick and difficult to navigate. The alien plants loomed high above them, their massive leaves and twisted vines casting long, eerie shadows in the dim light. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the occasional sharp, pungent odor from the wildlife that called the jungle home. The further they went, the more apparent the dangers of the jungle became. Strange, insect-like creatures skittered across the ground, some large enough to make even Jara hesitate before stepping forward. The trees themselves seemed alive, their bark pulsing with a faint bioluminescence as night fell, giving the forest an otherworldly glow. Despite the hazards around them, Jara couldn't help but glance at Daniel from time to time, her mind still racing with questions. She had never met a human like him. His refusal to kill her, his willingness to show mercy, It defied everything she had been taught about his kind. The humans were supposed to be brutal, efficient killers. That was why the Thara had respected them, even as enemies. But Daniel, he was different. "Why did you join this war?" Jara asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the stillness of the jungle. Daniel didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the path ahead for any sign of danger. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I didn't have much of a choice. The war came to us, not the other way around." Jara frowned. "And yet you fight. You kill." "I fight to protect my people," Daniel said, his voice steady. "But that doesn't mean I enjoy it, doesn't mean I think it's right." Jara let out a soft snort. "Weakness." "No," Daniel said, turning to face her, his gaze intense. "It's not weakness to want something better than endless bloodshed. It's strength to keep hoping for something more." Jara's steps faltered for a moment. His words struck her harder than she expected. Something more. Could there be something more than the endless cycle of war, honor, and death that had defined her people for generations? She shook her head, pushing the thought aside. "You speak like a child who doesn't understand the world. There's no place for hope in war." "There's always a place for hope," Daniel replied quietly. They had been walking for hours, the jungle growing denser and more difficult to traverse with every step. The night was fully upon them now, the eerie glow of the bioluminescent trees their only source of light. Despite the unease that hung between them, Daniel and Jara moved in sync, their senses finely attuned to the dangers around them. It was Jara who heard the rustle first, a soft sound, barely discernible from the natural hum of the jungle, but unmistakable to her warrior instincts. "Get down!" she hissed, grabbing Daniel's arm and pulling him behind a large tree. Daniel didn't hesitate. The two of them crouched low, listening as the sound of footsteps grew closer. Jara's heart raced in her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears. She recognized the movements, the stealthy approach. It was her people. "They're Thara," she whispered, her voice tight. "How many?" Daniel whispered back. Jara closed her eyes for a moment, focusing on the sounds. "At least 5, maybe more." Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle. "Can we avoid them?" Jara shook her head. "They'll find us. They're hunting for me." Daniel cursed under his breath. "Do we run?" "No," Jara replied, her voice firm. "We fight." Daniel met her gaze, seeing the determination in her eyes. She was a warrior through and through, and despite everything that had happened between them, she was ready to fight at his side. For the first time, Daniel felt something shift, an unspoken trust forming between them. "All right," Daniel said, his voice steady. "Let's fight." The jungle was unnervingly still as Daniel and Jara braced for the oncoming Thara patrol. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, and he quickly scanned their surroundings, looking for any advantage the dense foliage might provide. The towering trees and thick undergrowth offered plenty of cover, but the Thara were experts in jungle warfare. Jara, having fought alongside them for so long, knew this better than anyone. "They'll come fast, and they'll be quiet," Jara whispered, her violet eyes scanning the dimly lit forest. "They won't show mercy." Daniel nodded grimly. He had seen Thara in action before, though never this close. He could only imagine what it was like for Jara to fight her own kind. The internal conflict must have been eating at her, but there was no sign of hesitation in her gaze now. This was survival. Jara signaled with a sharp nod toward a cluster of large boulders partially hidden by thick ferns. "We'll ambush them from there. Use the terrain." Without a word, Daniel followed her lead, moving quickly but silently through the brush. They crouched behind the boulders, waiting, every nerve on edge. Daniel checked his rifle one last time, making sure it was ready. The weight of it felt heavier than usual, not because of the enemy, but because of the choice Jara was making by fighting alongside him. The soft rustle of leaves alerted them. The patrol was close. Through the trees, Daniel could just make out the silhouettes of the approaching warriors, their movements swift and deliberate. Jara's expression tightened as she recognized the leader of the patrol, an older Thara warrior, her long silver hair braided tightly down her back, her twin blades glinting in the low light. This was Jorak, a warrior of high status in the Thara hierarchy, and someone Jara had trained under in her youth. "She's one of their best," Jara whispered, her voice low. "If we take her down, the others might fall back." Daniel glanced at her. "You sure you're ready for this?" Jara's jaw clenched. "I was born ready." Without another word, Jara burst from their cover, a battle cry tearing from her throat as she charged at Jorak. The suddenness of the attack caught the Thara patrol off guard, and for a moment there was chaos as the warriors scrambled to defend themselves. Jorak recovered quickly, her eyes narrowing in fury as she recognized Jara. "Traitor!" she spat, her voice filled with venom. Jara's response was a furious clash of steel. Her blade met Jorak's with a loud clang, the force of their blows sending sparks flying. The two warriors moved with lethal grace, their movements so fluid and precise that it seemed like a deadly dance. Daniel, not wasting the opportunity, took aim at the other Thara warriors. His rifle hummed with energy as he fired, careful to aim for non-lethal shots. His goal wasn't to kill, just to incapacitate. He knew Jara would never forgive him if he slaughtered her people unnecessarily. The Thara were fast, but Daniel's military training had prepared him for just such situations. He ducked behind the boulders for cover as the patrol returned fire with their plasma weapons. The bright flashes of green light cut through the darkness, illuminating the jungle for brief moments. One warrior got too close, leaping through the air with a blade aimed at Daniel's throat. He rolled to the side just in time, his rifle swinging up to knock the warrior off balance. The Thara hit the ground hard, and before she could recover, Daniel pressed the barrel of his rifle against her chest. "Don't," he warned, his voice steady but cold. The warrior hesitated, her eyes filled with rage, but something in Daniel's gaze made her stop. She nodded once, and he backed away, sparing her. Meanwhile, Jara's battle with Jorak raged on. The older warrior fought with the strength and ferocity of a veteran, her movements sharp and precise. But Jara, even with her injury, was faster. Her blade moved in a blur, deflecting Jorak's attacks with a skill honed over years of training. "You have betrayed everything we stand for," Jorak shouted as their blades locked together. "You dishonor our people." Jara's eyes burned with anger. "You think I don't know that? But maybe it's time someone questioned our honor." With a sudden, powerful twist, Jara knocked Jorak's blade aside and delivered a swift kick to her chest, sending her stumbling back. Before Jorak could recover, Jara was on her, her blade pressed to the older warrior's throat. Jorak froze, her chest heaving as she glared up at Jara. "Do it," she hissed. "Prove you're no better than them." Jara's grip tightened on her blade, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment. She could end it right here, reclaim her honor, prove to herself and her people that she was still a true warrior. But Daniel's voice echoed in her mind, his words from earlier replaying over and over again. "Honor without compassion is just cruelty." With a shaky breath, Jara lowered her blade. Jorak's eyes widened in disbelief. "What are you doing?" "I'm showing you something different," Jara said softly, stepping back. "I'm showing you mercy." Jorak stared at her, stunned into silence. The other Thara warriors, seeing their leader disarmed, lowered their weapons, unsure of what to do next. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Jorak rose to her feet. She looked at Jara with something that wasn't quite respect, but it wasn't contempt either. It was something in between. Confusion, perhaps. Uncertainty. "You've lost your way, Jara," Jorak said quietly, her voice filled with both disappointment and grudging admiration. "But maybe there is something to learn from it." Without another word, Jorak motioned for the other warriors to follow her, and they melted back into the jungle, leaving Jara and Daniel alone once more. As the jungle fell silent once more, Jara stood motionless, her heart still racing from the battle. She had fought countless times, had faced down enemies without hesitation, but this was different. Sparing Jorak, showing mercy to one of her own. It had taken more out of her than any battle ever could. Daniel approached her cautiously, his rifle lowered. "You all right?" Jara didn't answer at first, still staring at the spot where Jorak had disappeared. Her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. What had she done? She had spared her enemy, her teacher, when she should have killed her. Everything she had been taught screamed that it was wrong, but in her heart, it felt right. "I don't know," Jara finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what I am anymore." Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle. "You're not alone. I think you've just taken the first step toward something bigger." Jara turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and something else, something softer. "You're a strange human, Daniel Gray." Daniel smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "I get that a lot." For a moment they stood there in silence, the tension of battle giving way to something more profound. Jara had spared Jorak not just because of Daniel's influence, but because she was starting to see that there was more to life, more to honor, than just dying in battle. They had fought side by side, and in doing so, they had begun to bridge the vast chasm between their peoples. Jara had chosen to let go of her rigid beliefs, if only for a moment, and it had changed something inside her. The weight of her decision hung in the air, heavy but not unbearable. With the immediate threat of the Thara patrol gone, Daniel and Jara knew they had to keep moving. The jungle still held its dangers, and there was no guarantee that they wouldn't encounter more enemies, human or Thara. But something had shifted between them. Where before, there had been only suspicion and tension, now there was a growing sense of understanding. They were still from different worlds, still bound by different beliefs, but they had found common ground in the strangest of circumstances. As they walked side by side through the jungle, the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had been through something profound, something that neither of them fully understood yet, but were beginning to accept. "Do you think your people will listen to you?" Daniel asked after a while, his voice cutting through the stillness. Jara let out a soft, bitter laugh. "My people? No. They will see me as a traitor. Jorak was right about that." "Then why didn't you kill her?" Daniel asked, his tone curious rather than accusatory. Jara sighed, running a hand through her short, sweat-drenched hair. "Because, I don't know. Maybe because of what you said. Maybe because I'm starting to see that killing isn't the only way to prove strength." Daniel nodded, satisfied with her answer. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight inside ourselves." Jara shot him a sideways glance. "You really are strange, human." Daniel chuckled. "I try." The days of trekking through the dense jungle felt like an eternity, but something had undeniably changed between Daniel and Jara. They had encountered no more patrols, though the looming threat of being found hung in the air like the thick humidity of Carthal's jungle. Each step brought them closer to the human extraction point, where Daniel hoped to find his squad, or what remained of it. Jara had grown quieter as they walked, though her sharp eyes still scanned their surroundings with the vigilance of a warrior. Yet there was a softness in her demeanor now, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. Her pride as a Thara warrior clashed with the reality of what she had experienced. Sparing Jorak, showing mercy, it went against everything she had been taught. As they neared a clearing, Daniel could sense her internal struggle. He didn't push her to speak, letting the silence between them do its work. But as they emerged into the open, Jara finally broke the quiet. "You know this can't last," she said softly, her voice carrying a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Daniel glanced at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Jara stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "When we reach your people, I won't be safe. And when I return to mine, I'll be branded a traitor." Daniel's heart sank. He knew she was right. Their worlds were still at war, and no matter what they had been through together, it wouldn't change the fact that she was Thara, and he was human. They were on opposing sides of a conflict far bigger than either of them. "But there has to be another way," Daniel argued, his voice filled with frustration. "You don't have to go back to your people. You could—" "Stay with you?" Jara interrupted, her tone sharp but not unkind. "I don't belong in your world, just as you don't belong in mine." Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but the truth of her words stung. Jara's identity was bound to her people, just as his was to his. No matter what had transpired between them, no matter how much they had grown to respect, maybe even trust one another, They were still bound by the weight of their respective cultures. Jara took a step closer to him, her eyes searching his face for something, perhaps an answer neither of them had. "You've shown me something I didn't know existed, Daniel. Mercy, compassion. But I can't stay with you. I have to go back." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest, a frustration he couldn't quite shake. He didn't want to let her go, not after everything they had been through, but he knew she had to make her own choice. "And what happens when you go back?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet. "What will they do to you?" Jara's gaze hardened. "That's not your concern." Daniel shook his head. "It is. After everything we've been through, it is." Jara hesitated, then let out a soft sigh. "I'll try to make them see what you've shown me, but I don't know if they'll listen. And if they don't, then I'll face whatever punishment they deem fit." The thought of her facing punishment for what she had done, for sparing him, for defying her people's rigid code, made Daniel's stomach churn. He couldn't let that happen. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice almost pleading. "There has to be another way." Jara's expression softened, and for the first time, Daniel saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something vulnerable. "I wish there was," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I can't run from who I am." They stood there in the clearing, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Daniel wanted to fight it, wanted to find some way to make her stay, but he knew deep down that it wasn't his decision to make. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jara turned and began walking again, her shoulders squared with resolve. Daniel followed, his heart heavy with the knowledge that their time together was running out. The extraction point was closer now, just a few more miles through the jungle. Daniel's squad had radioed in earlier that day, confirming the rendezvous. Relief should have flooded through him at the thought of reuniting with his people. But instead, all he felt was a growing sense of dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. They pushed through the last stretch of jungle and emerged into another clearing, this one larger and more open, with the human dropship visible in the distance, its metallic hull gleaming in the fading light. But something was wrong. The atmosphere felt tense, charged. As they approached, Daniel's comm device crackled to life. "Sergeant Gray, this is Lieutenant Sanchez. We've got Thara warriors inbound. Repeat, Thara inbound. Get to the extraction point immediately." Daniel's heart sank. So much for a peaceful extraction. He glanced at Jara, whose eyes were already scanning the tree line, her warrior instincts kicking in. "Your people are coming," she said grimly. "And so are yours," Daniel replied. Sure enough, through the trees on the far side of the clearing, the unmistakable shapes of Thara warriors began to appear, silent, lethal, and ready for battle. At the head of the group was Jorak, her face set in a mask of determination. She had brought reinforcements. Daniel cursed under his breath. "We don't have time for this." Jara's expression was unreadable, but Daniel could see the conflict brewing behind her eyes. She was torn, caught between her loyalty to her people and the strange bond that had formed between them. He knew what she was thinking, knew the weight of the choice she was about to make. Jorak's voice rang out across the clearing, sharp and commanding. "Jara, you betrayed us once. Don't make the same mistake again. Surrender the human and return with us. You can still redeem your honor." Jara's fists clenched at her sides, her jaw tight. She didn't respond immediately, her eyes flicking to Daniel, then back to Jorak. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of the decision crushing down on her. "Jara," Daniel's voice was quiet, filled with understanding. "Do what you have to do." For a long, agonizing moment, Jara remained still, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Then, with a deep sigh, she stepped forward, placing herself between Daniel and her people. "No," Jara said, her voice strong and steady. "I will not kill him." Jorak's eyes blazed with fury. "You would choose a human over your own people? You have lost your mind, Jara." Jara lifted her chin defiantly. "Maybe I have. Or maybe I've found something worth fighting for that doesn't end in death." The Thara warriors shifted uneasily, unsure of what to make of this new Jara. Daniel's squad had arrived now, their rifles trained on the Thara, ready for a fight. But no one moved. The two sides stood at an impasse, waiting for someone to make the first move. "I won't fight you, Jorak," Jara said, her voice softer now. "But I won't let you kill him either." Jorak's face twisted in rage, but before she could respond, the sound of engines roared overhead. The human dropship had arrived, hovering just above the clearing, its powerful thrusters kicking up dust and debris. "This isn't over," Jorak snarled, her eyes locking with Jara's. "You may have chosen mercy today, but your people will never forgive you." Jara didn't flinch. "I'll live with that." With a final glare, Jorak signaled to her warriors, and they melted back into the jungle, disappearing as quickly as they had come. The tension slowly ebbed from the clearing as the dropship descended, its ramp lowering to the ground. Daniel turned to Jara, his heart heavy with the weight of their unspoken goodbye. "You don't have to go back to them." Jara smiled sadly, her eyes filled with something like regret. "I do, but that doesn't mean I haven't changed." They stood there for a moment, the chaos of the world around them falling away. For just a few seconds, it was as if they were the only two people in the universe. And then, with a soft nod, Jara turned and walked away, disappearing into the jungle without another word. Daniel watched her go, a strange mixture of pride and sorrow filling his chest. She was right. She had changed. And maybe, just maybe, that change would ripple through her people, through the war, and bring about something better. As the dropship's engines roared to life and he boarded, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time he would see Jara. Somewhere out there, she was fighting a different battle, one that might one day bring their worlds together.